The second form of justice that we talk about is retributive justice. And this is perpetrator-oriented justice. So the goals of retributive justice are to punish the perpetrators, those responsible for past rights violations. And these include measures like administrative purges, so knock them out of the administrative apparatus. Lustration processes, so cleanse them from the state and other, whether through the bureaucracy, in the bureaucracy, or in other political institutions. And of course, criminal prosecutions. And we can separate criminal prosecutions into those for people who actually held their finger on the gun and those who actually ordered the prosecutions. When it comes to practical policies, though, the lines between retributive and restorative justice aren't so clear. So look at truth commissions, for instance. They're often lumped into the restorative pile. Victims are given a chance to tell their stories, sometimes hear apologies from perpetrators, and they nearly always receive acknowledgement from the state that what happened was bad. So this condemnation of the past rights violations. All these things, again, are important. But South Africa's last apartheid leader, F.W. de Klerk, really showed a lot of discomfort with his country's much heralded Truth Commission. South Africa had this very popular Truth Commission. Lots of countries around the world wanted to do commissions just like this. Very few actually did. But it was seen as this incredible effort towards reconciliation and confronting the past and then moving on. According to de Klerk, though, many whites worried that the stories that came out would serve as, quote, the basis for further recrimination, demonization, and persecution. There was a fear that the stories that would come out would also lead to broader collective guilt. All the whites are guilty. And now everybody knows what happened, and so the whites who are affiliated with the former government, or even unaffiliated, but de facto, I mean, they were white, they were the same race, that they would suffer because of this. In other words, things would just get worse. So they actually felt victimized by this restorative truth process. And indeed, there's always a question of whose truth is being established. And this isn't just about truth commissions, but the narratives that arise from any transitional justice policy. Criminal prosecutions. Why are there criminal prosecutions for this group, but not that? Why are there more for this group than for that group? Why is there compensation for this group, but not for this group? Why is there more from this group than this group? And the list goes on. So there's always a question about whose truth and the policies that derive from that whose truth question. For all of its theoretical advantages, transitional justice can be seen as costly in a number of ways. First of all, it can deteriorate administrative capacity. Administrative bans or cleanses, prosecutions, all these can eject the only people who know how to run the country. The state, the bureaucracy doesn't change when the leaders and the regime changes. Right? I mean, the people who are running the state apparatus, right? All the ministries, the institutions, the police, the military, they don't disappear, bam, when you have democracy. They're still there when a new democratic elite takes power. And so if you go in and you end up prosecuting a large number of them, or even a small number of them, which can lead to poor morale among the rest of them, you can really deteriorate your capacity. Transitional justice can deplete resources. It costs money to run trials. It costs money to run truth commissions. Compensation costs lots of money. Transitional justice can interfere with reconciliation. Maybe it's better to forget and let bygones be bygones. On the other hand, amnesties may be unpopular among victims and families who are looking for some sort of closure. And that can also prevent reconciliation. Transitional justice can actually run counter to the notion of rule of law at times. What if the crimes being alleged and being dealt with today were not at all crimes under the old regime? This dilemma is known as retroactive justice, pursuing crimes from the old regime that under the old regime weren't crimes. And this can all lead to political stability. Now in black and white, this is the sort of linchpin. In black and white, there are two opposing views on justice. Purists, including many international human rights advocates, argue that there can be no rule of law, no real system of democratic governance, so no democratic consolidation, unless those who violated human rights in the non-democratic period are punished, and unless the victims have their abuses addressed. These proponents of criminal accountability hold that charging individuals for their roles in yesterday's crimes is the most important step to reducing collective guilt, as I mentioned before, and placing society back on this equal footing so that they can move forward together. The opposing view is held by pragmatists, who frequently argue for the necessity of amnesty, based on the understanding that going after members of the old regime is just going to increase instability and make democratic consolidation more difficult. The problem, according to pragmatists, is that even the threat of punishment can be enough to marginalize supporters of the old regime, or affiliates or associates of the old regime, and turn them from potential converts to democracy, in other words, from people who accept the democratic rules of the game, into hostile enemies of this new order, which is seen as fundamentally unfair to them. None of these dilemmas are new. For centuries, emerging political elites have struggled with this question of how to account for human rights violations from some former period. Immediately after World War II, the Allied forces who were victorious put justice in the international realm for the first time. And they created what were called the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials in Germany and Japan for heinous wartime rights abuses by those two states. Within just a few years, though, the world was split by the Cold War. Right? By the late 1940s, early 1950s, the Cold War was in full swing, and justice fell to the wayside, both internationally, but also frequently domestically. There were quote-unquote more important things to do. So as authoritarian regimes in Latin America, in Africa, and Eastern Europe fell in the 1970s and in the 1980s, incoming elites, these new democratic elites, tried to balance the norms of justice that had emerged in the post-war era with political constraints that were present in the absence of all-out military victory, because it was very rare that you had an all-out military victory in these transitions. Often these were negotiated transitions. And the compromise was often truth commissions in place of amnesties or prosecutions. So prosecutions being the most aggressive, amnesties being the obviously least aggressive, put in these truth commissions. Some of them fuzzy, some of them quite clear, but it was an effort to put in restorative over retributive justice, and over no justice. So these compromises. Truth commissions were frequently seen as compromise justice. Since the 1990s, though, we've seen more moves toward criminal prosecution, and most importantly, the international ad hoc criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, which gave way to the International Criminal Court. Not to be confused with the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice settles legal disputes between states. The International Criminal Court deals with human rights abuses. With the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, there's now this permanent international court that digs into transitional justice issues, and we'll come back to this later.